Let me ask you something. Have you noticed how certain names keep returning to the headlines? No matter how much the world changes, empires rise, empire fall, borders shift, generations pass, and yet, somehow, the same regions, the same powers, the same tensions keep re-emerging at the center of history. Every time the Middle East shakes, every time Israel is surrounded, every time a power from the north makes a move, the same question comes back. Is this prophecy? Are we watching something ancient unfold in real time? Now, I want to be clear with you right from the start. This is not a video about fear. It's not about speculation. And it's not about chasing headlines. Because prophecy, real biblical prophecy, was never meant to make us panic. It was meant to wake us up. You see, most people approach prophecy the same way they approach a puzzle. They want quick answers, clear labels, a simple chart that tells them exactly who is who. But the Bible doesn't work like that. And God doesn't work like that. Let me take you somewhere for a moment. Imagine a man standing by a foreign river, far from home, far from everything familiar. His nation is broken, his city destroyed, his people scattered across the earth. And in that place, when hope seems impossible, God speaks, not just about the pain of the present, but about a future so unlikely that it would sound unbelievable. A nation reborn, a people regathered, forces rising from the far reaches of the north, a collision between human power and divine purpose. That man was the prophet Ezekiel, and the words he recorded over 2,500 years ago are now echoing louder than ever. Here's the mystery. Ezekiel never named modern nations. There was no Russia, no Turkey, no global superpowers as we know them today. And yet, what he described keeps aligning with our moment in history. So the real question isn't, can we match every ancient name to a modern map? The real question is this: why does this prophecy keep knocking on the door of our generation? Because there is a pattern in Scripture, a pattern where God moves nations without asking their permission, where even powers that resist him are still drawn into his purposes. The Bible uses a striking image for it. God says, I will put hooks in your jaws and I will turn you around. And if that pattern is real, if God truly directs the course of history, then this conversation isn't just about geopolitics. It's not just about Russia or the Middle East or war. It's about sovereignty. It's about timing. And it's about what it means to live faithfully when ancient prophecy begins to feel uncomfortably current. So tonight, I'm not asking you to accept someone else's conclusions. I'm asking you to think, to watch, to listen. Because when prophecy moves from the page to the present, the most important question is never what will happen next. The most important question is this: are we awake enough to recognize the hour we're living in? There's a question I hear everywhere I go, in churches, in emails, in quiet conversations after services, and it usually comes after a headline flashes across the screen or a war breaks out in the Middle East. And the question is simple, almost whispered, but loaded with weight. Is Ezekiel 38 talking about Russia? And every time that question comes up, it feels urgent. It feels heavy. It feels like we're standing on the edge of something. Because deep down, people aren't just asking about Russia. They're asking, are we running out of time? You see, Ezekiel chapter 38 has become one of the most talked about prophecies of our age, not because it's new, but because it refuses to stay in the past. It keeps resurfacing, generation after generation. Every time the world shakes, every time Israel is surrounded, every time a power from the north moves into the picture, and people want an answer, a clear one, a definitive one, something they can hold on to and say, this is it, now I understand. And that's human. Because when the world feels unstable, we crave certainty. We want prophecy to work like a map, with labels and arrows and neat explanations. But prophecy was never given to satisfy our need for control. It was given to awaken our hearts. Let me say something gently but clearly. The most dangerous thing we can do with prophecy is to make it smaller than God intended it to be, to turn it into a guessing game, a debate about names and sound-alikes, while missing the deeper revelation unfolding beneath it. Ezekiel wasn't writing from a place of comfort. He wasn't sitting in a study surrounded by books and theories. He was a man in exile, standing by the rivers of Babylon, watching his nation fall apart, his city burned, his people scattered. And it was there, in that place of loss, that God showed him not just what would happen, but how history itself would move under the hand of God. So when we ask, is this Russia? We may be asking the wrong question first, because before we ask who, we need to ask why. Why does this prophecy keep pressing into our moment? Why does it feel more relevant now than it did 100 years ago? Why do the same regions, the same tensions, the same patterns keep reappearing? As if history itself is being drawn toward a destination. And here's where we need to slow down. Because Ezekiel didn't give us a headline, he gave us a mystery. Not a puzzle to solve, but a warning and a promise woven together. That nations rise and fall, but God remains sovereign. That powers move, thinking they are acting on their own will, while unknowingly stepping into a divine script. So yes, the question everyone asks is about Russia. But the deeper question is this: what happens when prophecy stops being theoretical and starts feeling personal, when it moves from the page into the present moment? And if God is truly orchestrating history on that scale, then what does that mean for us? For how we live, how we watch, how we prepare. And as we step into this, we're going to look not just at names, but at patterns. Not just at nations, but at movements, because the answer may not be as simple as we want, but it may be far more revealing than we ever expected. And that's where we need to go next. One of the first places people run when they talk about Ezekiel 38 is a single word, a small word, but one that has carried a lot of weight over the years, and that word is Rosh. You've probably heard it taught this way: Gog of the land of Magog, the prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal. And almost immediately someone says, Rosh sounds like Russia. And just like that, a conclusion is formed. Charts are drawn, timelines are built, and the mystery feels solved. But here's where we need to slow down, because Scripture deserves better than sound-alike theology. The Bible was not written in English, and prophecy is not unlocked by how words happen to sound to modern ears. Rosh is a Hebrew word, and in Hebrew it doesn't mean Russia, it means head, chief, leader. It's the same root word used in Rosh Hashanah, the head of the year. In other words, many scholars understand that phrase not as a proper name at all, but as a title, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. And this matters, because when we rush to make Rosh into a modern nation, we may be forcing the text to say something it never intended to say. Let me put it this way. Just because two words sound similar doesn't mean they share the same origin or meaning. Austria and Australia sound alike, but they're not related. In the same way, Russia in Russian isn't even pronounced Rush or Rush, it's Rossiya, coming from an entirely different linguistic stream. And here's the danger. When we build prophecy on surface similarities, we risk missing the deeper truth God is revealing. Ezekiel was not playing word games. He was communicating a vision from God to a people in crisis. He wasn't trying to give future generations a clever code to crack. He was revealing how power would move, how leadership would rise, how forces would align against a restored Israel. And yet, there's something deeper going on here, because even though Rush may not linguistically equal Russia, the question still refuses to go away. Why? Because prophecy often works on more than one level. It's not just about vocabulary, it's about patterns. And here's where sound-alike theology fails us. It settles too quickly. It gives us a neat answer and tells us the investigation is over, when in reality, Scripture is inviting us to look deeper, to ask harder questions, to trace movements, peoples, and histories across time. The issue is not whether Rosh sounds like Russia. The issue is whether there is a greater prophetic pattern involving a power rising from the far north, a chief leader over aligned nations, moving against Israel in a restored land. When we replace careful study with convenient conclusions, we trade revelation for reassurance. And God is not calling us to be reassured by shortcuts. He's calling us to be awakened by truth. So before we rush ahead, before we lock ourselves into one interpretation and refuse to examine anything else, we need to step back and let Scripture speak on its own terms. Because once we do, we'll discover that the real mystery of Ezekiel 38 doesn't rest on a single word, but on entire peoples and regions whose stories didn't stop in ancient times. And that's where we need to turn next, to Meshech and Tubal, and to a land that history itself refused to keep in one place. When we move past the word Rosh, the prophecy doesn't get simpler, it gets richer. Because Ezekiel doesn't stop there. He names Meshech and Tubal. And this is where history begins to speak with surprising clarity. For centuries, scholars, Jewish and Christian alike, have traced these names, and almost unanimously they point us not to modern Russia, but to a specific ancient region known in the Bible and in classical history as Asia Minor, what we call today modern-day Turkey. Ancient Assyrian records speak of a people called Mushku and Tabal. Greek historians like Herodotus place them in Anatolia, near the Black Sea. The Jewish historian Josephus tells us the people of Meshech lived in that same region. In other words, these were not mysterious, far-off peoples to Ezekiel's audience. They were known, they were identifiable, they had a location, and at first glance, that seems to settle the issue. Until we remember one crucial thing: lands may stay put, but people rarely do. History is not static. Borders shift, empires collapse, cultures migrate. And this is where prophecy begins to stretch beyond a single moment in time. Ezekiel was naming peoples, not modern nation-states. He was identifying ancestral lines, not future passports. And that distinction matters more than we realize. Because when we freeze prophecy in one historical snapshot, we miss how God often works across centuries. Think about it. Those ancient peoples of Meshech and Tubal did not remain frozen in Anatolia for 2.5 millennia. Conquests came. The Greeks arrived. The Romans followed. Later, Islamic empires swept through. Then the Turks themselves entered the land, and the original populations were absorbed, displaced, or driven out. The land stayed. The names changed. But the people moved. And here's the key. Prophecy doesn't expire just because a people migrates. It travels with them. In Scripture, God consistently speaks in terms of lineage, movement, and destiny. Abraham left Ur. Israel left Egypt. Judah went into exile and returned. The Bible is a story of God moving people through history to fulfill purposes far greater than they can see at the time. So when Ezekiel names Meshech and Tubal, he is anchoring the prophecy in a real historical starting point. But he is not locking it there forever. He is showing us where the story begins, not necessarily where it ends. And this is why simplistic interpretations fail us. They assume that prophecy must remain geographically frozen, when in reality, history itself is fluid. The land of Meshech and Tubal would not stay still, and neither would the peoples connected to it. And once you begin to follow the trail, not just on a map, but through migrations, cultures, and bloodlines, you discover that the story doesn't end in Asia Minor. It moves north. It moves toward the Black Sea. It moves into regions that would one day give birth to entirely new civilizations. And that's where the mystery deepens. Because when Ezekiel spoke of forces rising against a restored Israel, he wasn't just pointing to a place, he was pointing to a process, a movement through time, a convergence that would only make full sense generations later. And to see that, we have to follow the people where history carried them next, into trade routes, seas, and migrations that quietly reshape the world, and that takes us to a clue many overlook, hidden not in a war prophecy, but in a passage about merchants and trade. There's a detail most people miss when they rush straight to Ezekiel 38, and it's hiding in plain sight just one chapter earlier. Long before Ezekiel speaks about invasion and armies, he speaks about something far quieter, something far less dramatic, but just as revealing. He speaks about merchants. In Ezekiel chapter 27, the prophet delivers a lament over the great trading city of Tyre, a hub of commerce, wealth, and global exchange in the ancient world. And as he lists the nations that traded with Tyre, their goods, their roots, their connections, two familiar names appear again, Meshech and Tubal. And Ezekiel says something striking about them. He says, "They were your merchants. They traded with you." Now pause for a moment and let that sink in. Merchants don't come from the farthest edges of the earth without reason. Trade in the ancient world was slow, dangerous, and regional. These weren't airplanes crossing continents overnight. These were ships hugging coastlines, caravans moving along established routes, relationships built through proximity and repeated contact. In other words, Meshech and Tubal had to be close enough, connected enough, accessible enough to regularly trade with Tyre, which sat along the coast of what we know today as Lebanon. That simple statement tells us something powerful. These peoples were not located in the remote reaches of the far north at that time. They were part of the Mediterranean and Black Sea trade network. They lived near the sea. They moved along routes of commerce. And that aligns perfectly with what history tells us about Asia Minor and the regions surrounding the Black Sea. Here's why this matters so much. Ezekiel is consistent. The same peoples he names in a prophecy of future conflict, he names earlier in a passage about trade. That means he is not speaking symbolically or vaguely. He is grounding his words in real historical relationships. These were known peoples with known locations and known interactions. And yet, there's a deeper layer here that often goes unnoticed. Trade routes are often the first paths of history. Before armies march, merchants travel. Before empires conquer, commerce connects. Trade reveals who is close, who is linked, who shares access to seas, rivers, and resources. And Ezekiel is quietly showing us the world as it existed in his day, a tightly connected region centered around the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. But here's the thing about trade routes. They don't stay frozen either. As peoples migrate, as empires rise and fall, those routes stretch, expand, and shift. The same corridors that once connected Tyre to Asia Minor would later extend northward, deeper into lands beyond the Black Sea. Commerce opens doors. Migration follows. History moves. So when we read Ezekiel 27 alongside Ezekiel 38, we begin to see something profound. Ezekiel is not contradicting himself. He is showing us a progression. First, connection, then movement, then convergence. Meshech and Tubal were once close enough to trade, but history would not leave them where they were. Their descendants, their cultural lines, their spheres of influence would travel, carried along the same routes that once brought goods to Tyre. And this is where prophecy stops being static and starts becoming dynamic. It's not locked to one coastline or one century. It unfolds as people move, as networks expand, as regions once connected by trade later become aligned by power. Ezekiel is giving us a snapshot, but God is revealing a timeline. And once we understand that, we're ready to follow the story beyond the Mediterranean, beyond Asia Minor, into the Black Sea region itself, because that's where history takes the next great turn and where the roots of something far larger begin to form. If there's one thing history teaches us, it's this. People don't stay where they start. Lands may keep their names. Mountains may stay in place. Seas may look the same on a map. But human history is a story of movement. And when we follow Meshech and Tubal beyond the pages of Scripture, that movement becomes the key that changes everything. After the age of the prophets, Asia Minor did not remain untouched. It became a crossroads of empires. Greeks moved through it. Romans absorbed it. Cultures blended, collided, and dissolved. And as centuries passed, the ancient peoples Ezekiel named did not simply disappear, they migrated. They moved north and east, along the same corridors opened by trade, rivers, and seas. One region in particular became a gathering point, a hinge of history, and that region was the Black Sea. The Black Sea was more than water. It was a meeting place between worlds, between Europe and Asia, between settled civilizations and emerging peoples. And it is here that historians begin to trace the origins of a group whose influence would one day stretch across half the globe, the Slavic peoples. Their beginnings are mysterious, but many scholars agree they emerged in the Bronze Age, somewhere north of the Black Sea, formed by migrations from regions that once included Asia Minor and its surrounding territories. Languages evolved, identities formed, and tribes spread outward in waves, carrying with them shared roots, shared sounds, shared bloodlines. And over time, one nation would rise from that stream of history as the largest Slavic power on earth, Russia. Now, let me be clear. This is not about forcing ancient names onto modern passports. This is about understanding how prophecy can move through time without changing its essence. Ezekiel was not predicting borders or flags. He was naming peoples, forces, origins, trajectories. He was planting markers at the beginning of a story that would take centuries to unfold. Think about it this way. If God speaks a prophetic word over a family, and generations later that family has moved across cities and continents, the prophecy doesn't vanish. It follows the lineage. It follows the movement. The address changes, but the identity remains. Scripture works the same way. That's why it's dangerous to read prophecy as if history froze the moment the ink dried. God writes with time as his canvas. So when we trace the journey from Asia Minor to the Black Sea, we're not stretching the text, we're following it. We're watching how the world Ezekiel knew slowly transformed into the world we inhabit today. The names changed, the languages shifted, empires rose and fell, but the geographic flow, the cultural inheritance, the directional pull of history remained. And here's the sobering thought. If Ezekiel's prophecy was anchored in peoples who would one day move northward, then the mention of forces coming from the far north may not be accidental at all. It may be the culmination of a long migration, a slow convergence, centuries in the making. And that means prophecy didn't suddenly appear in modern times. It has been quietly walking toward us all along. But this raises an even deeper question. If people moved, if identities evolved, if nations emerged from ancient roots, then how did Ezekiel describe the destination before it even existed? He didn't name it. He pointed north, far north. And to understand why he did that, we need to look closely at a phrase that carries more weight than most people realize. A phrase that shifts our focus from names to direction, from labels to location, and that's where we need to go next. There's something striking about the way Ezekiel describes the origin of this invading force, and it's something many people read right past without realizing how important it is. Ezekiel never names a modern nation. He never gives a flag, a border, or a capital city. Instead, he uses a phrase that feels intentionally open, intentionally directional. He says the armies will come from the far north. In Hebrew, it's Yerekete Tzafon, the uttermost north, the remotest north, the extreme north. And that choice of words tells us more than a name ever could. You see, if Ezekiel had tried to name a nation that didn't yet exist, the prophecy would have been meaningless to his audience and useless to future generations. There was no Russia. There was no Turkey as we know it today. No modern political map. But direction? Direction transcends time. A nation can be born, renamed, reshaped, or disappear entirely. But north is still north. And Ezekiel anchors the prophecy not to a temporary label, but to a permanent orientation. That's wisdom. That's divine foresight. And it forces us to ask a different kind of question. Instead of asking, which nation is Ezekiel naming? We have to ask, which power occupies that position when the prophecy comes into focus? In the ancient world, Asia Minor did lie north of Israel, and that's true. But it was not the farthest north. It was not the extreme north. It was a known region, a neighboring world. Ezekiel's language goes beyond that. It stretches past the familiar and points towards something more distant, something looming at the edge of the known world. And here's where it becomes unsettling. If you stand in Jerusalem and draw a straight line north, no angles, no curves, just north, you don't land in Turkey. You pass through it. You keep going, and eventually you reach a land vast beyond comparison, a land larger than any other on earth, a land sitting in the far north like a giant shadow over the map. That doesn't prove anything by itself, but it does explain why the question refuses to go away. Ezekiel didn't lock the prophecy into his own century. He left room for history to develop, for peoples to migrate, for empires to rise into that northern position. Ezekiel was not giving us a snapshot, he was giving us a trajectory. And scripture often works this way. Daniel speaks of a king of the north, not by name, but by position. Prophecy marks direction before it marks identity, because God sees the end from the beginning, and he knows which power will stand in that place when the moment arrives. That's why debates over names alone will never fully satisfy. Ezekiel wasn't asking us to decode syllables, he was asking us to discern seasons. He was pointing us toward a convergence, a time when a power from the uttermost north would align with others and move against a restored Israel. And once you understand that, something shifts. The prophecy stops being about linguistic tricks and starts being about historical gravity. Who stands in the far north when Israel is back in her land? Who holds influence over surrounding nations? Who has repeatedly found itself entangled, sometimes against its own will, in the story of Israel's rebirth and survival? Those questions take us beyond theory and into history itself. And when we follow that trail, we discover something extraordinary. Again and again, one particular northern power keeps appearing at the critical moments, shaping outcomes it never intended to shape. A nation that often resisted God, yet was used by him all the same. And that brings us to one of the most surprising patterns in all of modern history, a pattern of hooks, turns, and divine irony that we can no longer ignore. There is a line in Ezekiel's prophecy that is easy to overlook, but once you see it, you can't unsee it. God says to this great northern power, "I will put hooks in your jaws, and I will turn you around." That image is unsettling. It speaks of strength of something powerful, stubborn, resistant, and yet guided, redirected, pulled into a purpose it never chose. And when you step back and look at modern history with that image in mind, one nation stands out in a way that is almost impossible to ignore: Russia. Not because it has always loved Israel, not because it has honored God, but precisely because it hasn't. And yet, again and again, it finds itself playing a decisive role in Israel's resurrection. Let's go back for a moment, not to ancient times, but to the 20th century. After nearly 2,000 years of exile, the Jewish people were poised to return to their land. The world was reeling from war. Empires were collapsing. And the question of whether Israel would be reborn as a nation came to a vote at the United Nations in 1947. You might expect the Jewish people's greatest enemy at the time to oppose it. And yet, the Soviet Union, officially atheistic, deeply hostile to Judaism, did something shocking. Under Joseph Stalin, it voted in favor of the creation of Israel, not out of love for the Jewish people, but out of political calculation. Stalin believed a new Jewish state might weaken British influence in the Middle East. And so, against its own ideology, against its own history of persecution, Russia helped open the door for Israel's rebirth. Hooks in the jaws. It didn't stop there. When Israel declared independence and immediately faced annihilation by surrounding armies, an arms embargo was imposed. Israel was vulnerable, outnumbered, under-equipped. And once again, through Soviet-aligned Czechoslovakia, weapons flowed to Israel, some of them remnants of World War II, some even manufactured for Nazi Germany. Think about the irony of that. Weapons forged by hatred became tools of survival. God used what was meant for destruction to preserve life. And Israel stood. Then came 1967. Tensions were rising. Armies were mobilizing. And it was the Soviet Union that fed false intelligence to Arab nations, claiming Israel was about to attack Syria. The result was the Six-Day War. Israel was surrounded, threatened with extermination, and yet in 6 days, Jerusalem was reunited under Jewish control for the first time in nearly 2,000 years. Russia intended to destabilize. God used it to fulfill prophecy. Ezekiel spoke of a restored Israel before the eyes of the nations. And here it was happening again, against all odds, through forces that neither understood nor desired the outcome. Then, decades later, the Soviet Union collapsed. And with its fall came one of the greatest migrations in Jewish history. Millions of Jews left the former USSR and returned to Israel. To this day, Israel has one of the largest Russian-speaking populations outside of Russia itself. Once more, Russia became a channel through pressure, persecution, and collapse by which God gathered his people back to their land. Time after time, the pattern repeats. Russia resists God. Russia opposes Israel. And yet, at the critical moments, it is turned, redirected, used. This is not coincidence. This is the biblical pattern of Pharaoh, of Assyria, of Babylon, nations that did not serve God willingly, yet served his purposes all the same. And that's what makes this so sobering, because it tells us that prophecy doesn't require cooperation. God doesn't wait for permission. He moves through history with or without the consent of kings and empires. If he could use a godless superpower to restore Israel, then we are not just talking about ancient words coming true. We are talking about a living God actively shaping our world. And if that's true, then the question is no longer whether Russia has a role in prophecy. The real question is whether we recognize the pattern unfolding before our eyes. Because what we're seeing may not be the end of the story, but the setup for something even greater. A convergence that Scripture warned us about long ago, and one that calls for discernment, humility, and watchfulness as we step into what comes next. When you step back far enough, you begin to see that Russia is not an exception in Scripture, it's part of a pattern that runs like a thread through the entire Bible, a pattern where empires that reject God end up advancing his purposes anyway. Pharaoh never wanted to glorify God, yet through Pharaoh, God revealed his power and delivered Israel. Assyria boasted in its strength, yet God called it the rod of his anger, used for a season and then set aside. Babylon believed it ruled the world, yet it was raised up to discipline and then brought low in a single night. Rome crucified the Messiah, thinking it had silenced him forever, and instead became the instrument by which the gospel spread to the ends of the earth. None of these powers loved God. None of them intended to serve him, and yet every one of them did. That's the pattern, and that's why the image Ezekiel gives us is so striking. God doesn't say, "They will follow me willingly." He says, "I will put hooks in your jaws, and I will turn you around." That is not cooperation, that is sovereignty. Ezekiel is showing us something most people are uncomfortable with. God does not lose control of history when nations rebel. In fact, rebellion often becomes the very means by which his plans advance. Empires think they are acting freely, but Scripture tells us something else entirely, that the hearts of kings are in the hand of the Lord, and he turns them wherever he wills. And when you apply that lens to our world, suddenly the chaos looks different. Wars are no longer random. Alliances are no longer accidental. Even opposition itself can become a tool. This doesn't mean every conflict is directly prophesied, and it doesn't mean we should read every headline as fulfillment. But it does mean this: history has direction, and that direction is not set by human ambition alone. Think about how unsettling that must be for the nations themselves. To believe you are shaping the world only to discover you are being shaped. To think you are resisting God, only to find that resistance itself has been woven into his plan. That's why Scripture calls this a mystery. Not because it's unknowable, but because it humbles us. It strips away the illusion that humanity is in charge. And this is where the conversation must shift from geopolitics to the soul. Because if God can guide empires that hate him, if he can use powers that deny him, then what does that say about his authority over our personal lives, over our plans, our fears, our sense of control? The pattern of the hooks tells us something deeply reassuring and deeply challenging at the same time. Nothing is wasted. Not persecution, not opposition, not even chaos. God can bend it all toward his purposes. And that means the real danger is not that prophecy will unfold without us understanding every detail. The real danger is that we will become so focused on nations and timelines that we miss what God is asking of us in the middle of it all. Because prophecy is never given just to inform, it's given to transform. It's meant to shape how we live, how we watch, how we remain faithful when the world feels unstable. And that brings everything home. Because once we see the pattern, once we recognize that God is still sovereign, still active, still guiding history toward its appointed end, the most important question is no longer about empires at all. It's about us, about how we live in this moment, about whether we are awake, anchored, and ready for what lies ahead. And that's where this all becomes personal. Because the final question prophecy asks is not, do you understand the future? It's, are you living in light of it? So what does all of this mean for you? Not for nations, not for governments, not for maps and theories, but for you, sitting here, listening, living your life in a world that feels like it's standing on the edge of something. Because prophecy was never given to turn us into spectators of history. It was given to shape us into people who know how to live when history starts to tremble. The Bible never says we will understand every detail. It never promises that every mystery will be solved before it happens. What it does call us to be is watchful, not fearful, not obsessed. Watchful. There's a difference. Fear paralyzes. Obsession distracts. But watchfulness sharpens the soul. Jesus didn't tell his disciples to calculate dates or decode empires. He told them to stay awake, to be faithful, to live as people who know that this world is not random and that history is moving toward an appointed end. And here's the danger for our generation. We live in an age of constant headlines, endless opinions, non-stop information. It's easy to become either numb or consumed. Either we shrug and say, it's always been bad, or we spiral into anxiety, convinced everything is about to collapse tomorrow. Neither response is biblical. God calls us to something steadier, something deeper. He calls us to live anchored in truth, anchored in Scripture, anchored in the unshakable reality that He is still on the throne. Ezekiel saw chaos, exile, and destruction with his own eyes, and yet God didn't tell him everything will be easy. He showed him that even in the chaos, there was purpose. Even in the shaking, there was direction. Even when nations raged, God was not reacting, He was reigning. And that truth changes how we live. It means you don't have to panic when the world feels unstable. It means you don't have to place your hope in governments, economies, or military power. It means you don't have to chase every new theory or fear every new crisis. Because your security was never meant to come from understanding the future perfectly. It was meant to come from knowing the one who holds it. Watchfulness is not about staring at the sky. It's about examining the heart. It's about asking, am I living the kind of life I would want to be living if today were the day? It's about loving people deeply, walking humbly, staying faithful in the ordinary moments, because that's where readiness is formed. Prophecy reminds us that time is precious, that opportunities matter, that choices echo into eternity. And if God can move empires to fulfill His purposes, then He can certainly move in your life, in your struggles, your uncertainties, your unanswered questions. Nothing is too small. Nothing is wasted. So as we stand in a world on the brink, don't let fear define you. Let faith steady you. Don't let speculation distract you. Let devotion ground you. Lift your eyes, not just to the signs of the times, but to the God of all time. Because the greatest preparation for what's coming is not knowing every detail of prophecy. It's living every day in the light of truth, hope, and faithfulness. Stay awake, stay anchored, and above all, stay close to Him.